Hello everybody, this is a review for James S.A. Corey's Leviathan Wakes. This is the first sci-fi review that I'm doing on the channel, which I am super excited about. Sci-fi is not normally my thing. Now I do like some sci-fi like Dune or Ender's Game, but I think both of those sort of borrow from other genres as well and aren't like pure science fiction like the Asimovs of the world that really deal with like scientific questions of humanity and progress. I find those discussions interesting, but I generally find narrative forms around them not as compelling as narrative forms in fantasy. And Dune, I think, is probably even more fantasy than sci-fi, to be honest, the actual story itself. So all that to say is, I wasn't expecting, coming into Leviathan Wakes, to like this book as much as I did, and I did really enjoy it. I found it a great, fun, and yet also meaningful read, and so right off the bat, highly would recommend it. The basic plot of Leviathan Wakes is hard to get into because there is so much changing elements and surprise things that happen that if I go too far into the plot itself, it's gonna get spoilery. I should say, like most of my reviews, I'm going to have a non-spoiler section here at the beginning, give my final grade, and then have a section at the end where I do talk spoilers, because I really like talking about spoilers of books that I've read. The non-spoiler version of the plot summary is really to say that this book revolves around two characters, Holden and Miller. Miller is a detective on a Belter city, and I'll get to explain that in a second. And Holden is a pilot on an ice rig, which basically brings frozen ice to colonies in the outer parts of the solar system to provide that, well, not solar system, our galaxy, to provide them water. And that sounds really basic, but it is basic, and it builds and builds and builds to get really gigantic in scale. The world in this book I find very fascinating. It's built around the idea that there's three main sort of powers in our particular galaxy. We've moved beyond like countries and that being our definitive, and now it is planets or things that belong to those particular planets. So in this universe, there are two main powers: Earth, which is now kind of unified as a singular whole, and then Mars, which is another huge power. And then in between and sort of warring for control are Belters, or the Belt. Those who live in and around the asteroid belt, which provides a lot of rich mineral resources and just general natural resources, as well as provides good way stations in this like larger galaxy exploration that is taking place. So the politics are actually very rich and done well in a unique way. The Belters also, because they grew up in different G-force or gravity force upon them, grow to even look different than humans from high gravity environments like Mars, which has a fake atmosphere at this point that I think gives a full G, and then obviously our full G atmosphere here on Earth. So Belters are sort of like longer humans, so to speak, and they have skinnier limbs and I think bigger heads, which I think is scientifically accurate. I haven't really looked into it that much, but I think that's really interesting because it causes obviously a ton of tension and makes for very clear cultural lines, which just add more depth of story to the world. I also really appreciate that all of this world building, all that I'm talking about, is explained to you without breaking perspective. This is something I've been critical of other authors at times, where they try to dump all this information about the world on you, and to do so they have to explain things in such a way that you would never have the person whose perspective you're in explain it that way, because it's just the regular world to them. I'm going to give two examples of where I think Corey, which is actually a pen name for two different authors, do a good job of building this world without breaking that perspective. One is with the Belter language, so the on-the-ground version of language spoken on these Belter settlements, because it's not just straight English, because that wouldn't make sense. they tell you they have people speak to you in Belter a couple of times, and what's interesting reading it is that like a lot of the words, but they just don't fit together real well. It actually reminds me a lot of trying to read Middle English, if you've ever tried to do that, or like even English from a different era. You can kind of put things together, but it's not perfect. And that's because the language itself is a mixture and bastardization of a lot of different languages. In our world, there's some Chinese, there's some French, there's some Spanish, there's some English, obviously, there's some German, and it's all sort of combined into this weird bastardization we can't really understand fully. You kind of get bits and pieces. I think that's really interesting because that's sort of how humanity has evolved in the past and language has evolved in the past, and so it makes sense that it would do that in the future. I just thought that was very thoughtful. Another one that I think this is maybe a minor spoiler, but not really. It's early on. Holden, one of the main characters, comes from a multi-parental family and commune, and he just kind of throws that out there and doesn't really return or explain it at all. He just kind of throws it out as something that is obvious. And again, to him it is. To him it's his world and how he grew up and how, life exists. Even for us in our current era, it would be weird. So I love the way that they do that, and there's a lot of much bigger examples I could give, but those are spoilery. So really loved the world building. I thought it was done carefully and was unique, but also was done without breaking character perspective. Really appreciated that. The book is also really genre bending, which I appreciate. It's obviously at its core a sci-fi tale, but there's elements of horror, there's some noir, there's a mystery novel feel, like crime element feel. It's just a lot of good elements. With the politics, it can get into thriller category and mystery. It's just a lot of different stuff in just these, I think, 500 or so pages. Because of all of those changes and how fast these elements come at you, there's also a very good pace. Like most books, in the middle it slows down a little bit to sort of explain what's happening, but not for long. It really does catch you and keep going towards the conclusion, and really liked it. I also really liked the core character depth of the two main characters, Miller and Holden. They have very different viewpoints of the world and justice and how it should work, and it's really not compromising through the whole book. I'll talk more about that in the spoiler section, so if you haven't read this book, go read it and come back and see what I think about that. But I think, again, that's something that's done carefully by these authors and well, not just for story purposes, but for thematic purposes. I think this is going to bring an end to my spoiler-free discussion, but before I go to my spoiler-filled discussion, I want to say again that I highly recommend this and give this a grade on my scale. If you don't know about my scale, check a link in the description below that will tell you, will link you to a video that describes it in greater detail. But I'm going to give this a universal recommend. I really loved it. I think anyone can read it and really enjoy it. Really, really well done. It's not quite best of all time, but it really builds an interesting world. So I would highly recommend checking out Leviathan Wakes and the Expanse universe as a whole. Alright, now it is time for some spoiler discussions of Leviathan Wakes. First and foremost, I want to say I really loved the zombie twist. Did not see it coming at all. Was grossed out by it, but not too much. Just was really unique in that it kind of came out of nowhere, wasn't expecting it. It was unrelenting in its imagery, and yet it didn't like dwell on it. Like it didn't all of a sudden become a zombie novel. That time at Eros is like zombie-like, and it's kind of this survivalist tale. But once we get by that, we get back to the science and why this is happening. It brings about really interesting questions about evolution, human evolution, and should we reject that? And the fact that this is a weapon from a higher intelligence somewhere out there brings out all these mysteries. But because of the way the story is written, we don't really get to dwell on that till the very end, the epilogue, where everyone's like, well, this is great, we kind of won, but what's going to happen on Venus? There's still that other intelligence out there, we need to prepare for this. I think all of that is fascinating and really well done, and that there's zombies in it, which is cool. I'm not even that much of a fan of horror or zombies in general, but I thought it was done really well. I said this in my spoiler-free discussion, but I can get into it a little bit more here. The politics of Mars and Earth and the Belters I thought is fascinating, and that there are constantly these almost wars happening. The tension there really reminds me of, in history, like the pre-World War I days, or like the Napoleonic 100-year Hundred Years' War era of European history, where there's this clear setting up of massive war and massive scale that had never been seen before. And it's all in the hands of people whose hands it shouldn't be in. Like, we're standing on a knife's edge, and there's just someone, if they get really annoyed, can all of a sudden start this devastation. So I thought all of that was really well done, really interesting, very good commentary on how the human race should be unified and isn't, even in these extreme circumstances. I think is good, speaking for us today, as well as speaking about our future as a species. And as I mentioned, I love the central tension between Miller and Holden, and particularly about who should act, who should know things about the world, and how they should deal with this threat. I think Miller is interesting as this policeman, this police officer. He has a lot of faith in the system itself, and that they sort of stand between sort of chaos and disorder by like their justice keeping. But at the same time, so like that shows forth in how he doesn't really trust the people, sort of democracy, the common person. And this shows out in a lot of times how he is trying to suppress information from getting out. Like, he rebukes Holden a lot because he tells people about the information, doesn't trust the people to deliver justice. And so he's not for trials. He wants to take this into his own hands. He thinks he alone or some particular people have the strength to merit justice or to stop the world or to take care of problems. I strongly push back against that ideology. I do not like it, and I don't think Miller, his ideology is a good one. I think it comes from years of being jaded in crime and the world, and I think we have seen that in our world and in the United States in particular, twisted to some terrible political ends. And I like that the book is unrelenting with that. Like, Miller's story is not a good one, is not a positive one. Even his obsession with Julie, I think, is shown in a very selfish and dark light. Obviously, there's a lot of mental illness and depression taking place within that. I think it shows the devastation that can cause, especially since he's not willing to get help about that kind of thing. He's even jaded and looking for help with like psychiatrists and those kind of things. And so I think his story is really supposed to be a tragedy. That's how I read the work. However, in discussions with other people, especially at the Shelf Space Discord, where Leviathan Wakes was the book of the month in October, not a lot of people feel that way. They feel positive about Miller and some of his things, which kind of makes me rethink the novel, because I don't think that's what I want it to be, but that's how I read the novel. So I realize it's not for everyone, but that's how I read Miller. Holden, on the other hand, is like a, broadly speaking, democratic-minded person. Information needs to get to the people. Kind of a less extreme version of Edward Snowden, right? We can't just keep information from people. We need to give them the information. They can make their own choices. And it's worse to make the choices for them. And that does get into trouble, and that comes with various, creates harder situations sometimes. But I'm actually for that viewpoint of it. Justice, that we need to trust the people, and we can only get through this by unifying together behind a shared common ideal. I share that much more in common with Holden. And again, talking with people from Shelf Space, it's interesting that a lot of them found that frustrating about Holden, that he is such an idealist, they think he is naive. And perhaps at times he is, but I actually found him to be the most relatable ideologically, and he does make choices, and he's a faulted character, but I think his motivations and his desires, because they are pure, I am much more drawn to as a character, and I think he grows and is pretty unrelenting in what he believes in, and I find that in this particular case, with his viewpoint, attractive. So I liked Holden as a character. I really liked his relationship with Naomi, and that while there was like real tension about like if this was actually going to happen, and we wanted it, I at least wanted this ship to happen. When it did, it wasn't like this like awkward, like, oh, they're miscommunicating. Like, Naomi was just like, listen, I think this is cool. I really like this. This is exclusive. It does mean something to me, but like, don't get crazy about it. Like, I thought that was great. I loved that. Big fan of that love story, and I hope it continues. Naomi and Amos and Alex, I think, are like all great fun side characters outside of just the tension of those main two. Finally, before leaving and signing off this review, I want to talk about a lot of interesting naming conventions in this book. There's a couple that are like obviously like thrown out references. Like there's a reference to Dune and fear being the mind killer, and that's even referenced like as the old story says. So like that's clearly a throw out to Dune, which I think is cool. There's obviously that called out to Don Quixote, which is made and referenced as being made in the book, which I think is cool. But there's a couple others that I'm interested in. First is the naming convention of Holden himself. I don't know that that name's widely popular or not, but it, in my eyes, was a reference probably to Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye. If you've read that book, Holden Caulfield is like the poster boy for existential nihilism, and so I think it's really interesting to give a character like Holden in Leviathan Wakes, who is an idealist, that title. I think it's a very fun sort of contra naming convention, because Holden in Catcher in the Rye is definitely not like Holden in Leviathan Wakes. In fact, they're basically at polar opposite sides of the ideological continuum. So I think that's cool, and I have to think that's purposeful. Others that I'm not sure are purposeful, one of the mad scientists, or the mad scientist, is named Dresden. Seems like quite a clear call out to the Dresden Files. I don't know if that's just a fun sort of shout out to the Dresden Files, or maybe calling out Harry Dresden the character. I've only read 2 Dresden File books, so I couldn't really get deeply into that, but that name is so rare that I think it's interesting to point out. I'd like someone who knows more about Dresden in the comments below. Let me know if you think that's a reference to something. Leviathan Wakes, the actual name of the book, I think is fascinating, because the word Leviathan, unless I'm wrong, never appears in the book. So why is it called Leviathan Wakes? Well, Leviathan is in Hebrew mythology, in the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, a sea serpent, kind of like a sea dragon, this large, powerful force of nature that is greatly feared by sailors especially, obviously, but everyone who encounters it. It's like this most powerful of sea creatures. So it could just mean really, this the start of something massive, a beast, in a metaphorical sense, being awakened with the proto-molecule, which by itself would be cool just because it's a cool name. I think even more interestingly, this might be stretching, I might be reading too much into this, but Leviathan is one of the most famous philosophical works and social political works of all time by Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher. That book laid the groundwork for social contract theory, which is basically the idea that people of large regions need to all agree on a particular social contract or way of being ruled, and that is what stands between humanity and chaos, or its brute natural, survival of the fittest kind of thing. And that even Hobbes argues, even things like monarchies where like one person rules, that's really a social contract of a different kind, where the people are still saying, okay, we'll believe in the divine right to rule or whatever as long as you take care of us. And at a certain point, in things like the English Revolution, even monarchies can be brought down if they're not holding their side of the social contract. So all of these like social structures that we have in place is by agreement of the whole. And obviously that's incredibly influential with like Scottish common sense realism and a lot of things that themselves brought about the US constitutional government and the French revolutions and a lot of those sort of things. So Leviathan is a really important work, not just in philosophy, but in world history. So I think it'd be interesting, especially in a book that is really about humanity needing to come together between Mars, the Belt, and Earth to be unified to meet a new natural outside force, and that only that unification is going to keep them from being annihilated by this alien life form, proto-molecule, and whatever that means for humanity as a whole. That there needs to be a social contract between these larger groups for the survival of humanity. I think that'd be very interesting. I'd be curious if these authors reference Hobbes at all in talking about the book or why they named it that way. I don't know if they did. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but I think that'd be very interesting. You guys know I love philosophy, so always can throw some stuff out there. Anyway, that is my review of Leviathan Wakes. Again, highly would recommend it. I'm definitely going to keep going in the Expanse series to see what happens and to explore these wider themes more. So again, universal recommend from me. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Let me know if you've read it, if you think about what you think about Leviathan Wakes. As always, first in, last out.